Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, good evening and welcome to this evening on which we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the John Adams Institute. Most of you present here tonight have followed the Institute's ups and downs and narrow escapes. It is with great pleasure and satisfaction that we are able to announce that the lecture series are still very much alive. My name is Anne Wertheim and I am the director of the John Adams Institute. We are honored tonight to welcome the mayor of Amsterdam, Mr. Schelto Patijn, who is an ardent reader. Mr. Patijn, on the day of the Eiburg referendum, we are happy that you have found time to open this special lecture, and we know that you have to leave right away. Amsterdam, city of publishers, writers and bookshops, is becoming an international meeting place for the literary scene. I'm glad that the John Adams Institute can make its own contribution to this development, and I trust that in the near future we will be marked as the best American lecture center in Europe. I will not go into detail on what we are doing and who is sponsoring us and which authors have graced our podium in the past. The information is on display in the hall between the pictures there, and this will make it clear to you. I would like to thank, however, Eva van Stockhausen and Helene Ronner, who decorated the entrance hall with those memorable events. We are pleased to welcome tonight Professor Bradbury, world specialist on American literature. Professor Bradbury, welcome to Amsterdam. I have already discovered that you're very much enjoying your stay. Ladies and gentlemen, although there is a list of sponsors in the hall, there are a few important sponsors who shouldn't remain unmentioned. NOG Verzekeringen, our main sponsor, it's an insurance company. This sponsor is assuring our survival from 1995 till 1998. Furthermore, the Renaissance Amsterdam Hotel that has been offering hospitality to our guest speakers since the start of our lecture series. And the United States Information Service, in short, USIS, who is always present to help us out. I would like to extend a special welcome to the new American consul, Miss Diane Androok, and a special thanks to the British Council, who has kindly offered assistance in making this evening possible, and to all our volunteers who make all evenings possible. Mr. Bradbury will be introduced by Alfons Lammers, professor of American history in Leiden and author of the biography Roosevelt. After Mr. Bradbury's speech, we suggest, in order to save time, that we continue right away with the interview section. Hans Bouman, literary critic, will interview Mr. Bradbury and welcome questions from the audience. The evening's program will end at 9:45 at the very, very latest. Mr. Patijn, may I invite you to the podium? And thank you and enjoy your evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, my first sentence on my piece of paper: it is a great pleasure for me to be here this evening, but since I leave you in 3 minutes from now, it is like going to Macbeth and leaving before the curtain opens. I'm sorry, but there is something to do in Amsterdam today. I explained it to Mr. Bradbury a little bit. Never introduce a referendum because it will split your whole day and it has to do with something what is called egg borrow, and don't worry, it is unexplainable to anybody. You are, Mr. Bradbury, far more capable of introducing the cultural relations between the New World and the Old World, the United States of America and Europe. And I will not say a word to it, but let me say a few words about the John Adams Institute. 10 years, that's great for an institute with all, as Anne Wertheim said, its ups and downs. Congratulations to Anne Wertheim and her staff, who has worked with so much enthusiasm to promote the American culture on the continent and in Amsterdam especially. It hasn't always been easy for the John Adams Institute. It was insecure, not because of the lack of success of the lectures or the diminishing interest from the public. On the contrary, it was simply because of lack of finances. Fortunately, as Anne Wertheim said, the near future is secured with the help of a new sponsor. And so the John Adams Institute in Amsterdam is alive and kicking. And I'm always surprised, as an ardent reader of American literature, how the Institute is capable time and time again to introduce the most famous American and English writers to Amsterdam. As a major of Amsterdam, I cannot, of course, conceal the attraction of this city to these foreign writers, but still, I think Anne Wertheim and her staff have something to do with the fact that they're actually coming. I had a very informal and very funny meeting with Chaim Potok last year. He was invited and in a full audience in a very big place, and I arrived on my bicycle, as I normally do, and he stepped towards me and asked, fully surprised, if I always transported myself by bicycle and where my bodyguards were. And the photograph of Potok standing next to me while he was fixing the lock of my bicycle to a gate was published in many newspapers. And it was for me a great pleasure to meet a man of whom I have read all his books. And let me say this, the Institute shows with Malcolm Bradbury here tonight how much it has helped to strengthen the excellent relations between the Netherlands and the United States of America. We have so much in common, we have so much in the past that we share. And the huge success of the lectures of the John Adams Institute prove the eagerness of so many in this country for the knowledge of the rich American culture. We are proud in Amsterdam that we can host this institute. And we are convinced that the John Adams Institute, under the direction of Anne Wertheim, will have a very good future. Thank you for giving me 3 minutes. Apologize again for leaving you immediately. Thank you very much.
For the innocent from Leiden, it's quite something to be in Amsterdam, this fourmillante cité. Especially so because we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the union between Anne Wertheim and John Adams. Thanks to the Institute this remarkable couple brought forth, we have been able during the past decade to see American fame in the flesh. As she said yesterday in NRC Handelsblad, Mrs. Wertheim once dreamt of an institute on the scale of the Maison Descartes or the new Goethe Institute. If I understand her correctly, not all of this came true because there's on the American side a strong belief that the Netherlands and the rest of Europe embrace all things American more or less spontaneously. If the director is right, and if we would like to help her, there's one thing we ought to do. Develop again, at least temporarily, a healthy dose of old-fashioned Dutch anti-Americanism. And then I won't insist on transplanting the Institute to Leiden, where the Pilgrim Fathers once lived and departed from, and where John Adams, of course, had his best contacts. What Mrs. Wertheim may lack in funds, she amply compensates by her enthusiasm and persuasive capacities. I'm sure that if Emerson, Henry James, Hemingway, or Gertrude Stein were still alive, they would make their appearance in the Red Hat today. And think of Samuel Henry Miller in Amsterdam. It's a pity we can only invite the living, but sometimes the living are as interesting as the dead. Being very much alive, Mr. Bradbury, our honored guest, is clearly a case in point. Introducing him is no small task. I have to choose my words carefully because Mr. Bradbury has been introduced to audiences in Britain and elsewhere many, many times. And the introducers got it frequently wrong. That at least is what I gather from the first article in Mr. Bradbury's collection of essays, No, Not Bloomsbury. He writes, "From time to time, forsaking all else, I go out into the world and give lectures, finding myself on platforms in distant rooms in foreign countries where someone introduces me as a speaker who needs absolutely no introduction. This is generally followed by a long one, usually, according to the rules of the genre, a little inaccurate. I do not say this," Mr. Bradbury continues, "to criticize introducers, for to them I've long been grateful. Theirs is a difficult and boring job, generally unappreciated. Trying not to feel sorry for myself, and also trying not to be a bore, a deadly sin in Great Britain, and I assume in sinful Amsterdam too, I just want to introduce Mr. Bradbury as a literary historian who in 1995 published his masterpiece, the sum of his work, Dangerous Pilgrimages, Transatlantic Mythologies and a Novel. Mr. Bradbury, the creative writer, from Eating People is Wrong to History Man and Rates of Exchange, I leave to others, because I've always stayed clear of so-called campus novels or novels about academicians in general. I meet them every day and therefore know, I guess, how pathetic they frequently are and how right our Dutch historian Presser was in once stating that the humanities don't humanize. The campus is a microcosm of human existence. Life must be somewhat more elevating and exciting than the absurd little quarrels of university peoples or history men. I prefer not to look into the mirror, and that's why I'm no connoisseur of Mr. Bradbury's depiction of the British or American academia. I rather consider Dangerous Pilgrimages to be a non-academic study. Summarizing the book in a few words is quite impossible. Just read it and enjoy the intricate tale of Americans going to Europe and Europeans going to America, writing about what they had in common and most of all what made them different. Nathaniel Hawthorne once defined his dear native land, the young republic on the eve of the Civil War, as a country where there is no shadow, no mystery, no picturesque or gloomy wrong, not anything but a commonplace prosperity. We all know and read the many American writers who later on, in the very prosperous 20s, exiled themselves to the old world with its supposedly dark, dark secrets. World War II changed America in a mighty empire, and culturally it became imperial too. When Mr. Bradbury, as a brill-creamed youth, for the first time set sail to the United States in 1955, he went to the America of, in his words, Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe, J.D. Salinger and Dave Brubeck, shark-toothed Buicks and meat-filled hamburgers, jeans and T-shirts. In short, the perfect contrast to grim, moral, and depressing 50s England. A century after Hawthorne, America, according to Mr. Bradbury, had changed in a country where all that is freest and most novel came from. The best movies, the best clothes, the best ice cream, the best gum, the best cars, the best comics, the best jazz, even the best books. Mr. Bradbury then continues in Dangerous Pilgrimages. America had long stood for the myth of liberation, but at no recent time had the old myth seemed newer than it did in the mid-50s. Though I was only 15 in these mid-50s, I tend to agree with Mr. Bradbury. And just like him, I guess, I'm somewhat at a loss to understand what exactly America, mightier than ever, stands for today. And here's my anti-Americanism as a gift to you. Traveling through the opportunity paradise of Bill Clinton, do we still see the sein de la vie future? And if so, do we like this future as much as we hoped in the 50s that Europe would become another America? Dangerous Pilgrimages whets my appetite for the masterwork that brings together between two covers the transatlantic influences, not only in literature, but in all of the arts, in painting, music, dance, and architecture, and maybe also in politics, business, and industry. It will never be written, I'm afraid, because the subject is simply too large to grasp for the single individual. All the more reason to be grateful for the generous and highly personal fragment of this imaginary work which Mr. Bradbury has given us. If I were a critic instead of a historian, there's only one point I would make about Dangerous Pilgrimages. Sometimes Mr. Bradbury seems too prone, which he readily admits, to equate British writers with European writers. Yes, Britain belongs to Europe, and Europe to Britain, but only partly so. Which brings me to an intriguing remark Mr. Bradbury makes in the preface of his book. From the 19th century on, to American observers, the people in Europe were first of all Europeans, Mr. Bradbury contends. In spite of all frontiers, all wars, and all cultural divisiveness, in the American mind, there was this one Europe, either in the shape of America's antipode or America's antidote. Maybe Europe was an American myth, but the myth had, on the long run, important consequences. For the Americans converted the Europeans to Europe again. In the words of Mr. Bradbury, the mind of Europe was for most people in most centuries at the most vague abstraction. Nowadays, as they wave their blue 12-starred flags and sing the ode to joy, the movers and shakers of the European community, the new Europe, should feel very grateful to this refraction back from America, which did nearly everything to get them this far. I can hardly resist the temptation to go on quoting Malcolm Bradbury, our European compatriot, and therefore it is far more sensible to give him the floor as the writer, critic, and literary historian who absolutely needs no introduction. Thank you.
Well, it's a great honor and a great privilege to be here, and especially for the 10th anniversary of the John Adams Institute, who have been wonderful hosts to me. And amongst their hospitality, took me to the American Embassy in The Hague, where, of course, the portrait of John Adams hangs over the fireplace. I think it's a copy. But we're used to copies in Amsterdam, and an Adams inscription underneath. The American ambassador, in his comments there, did point out that when John Adams was appointed American ambassador to the Netherlands in 1780 or 81, the British, not surprisingly, were not very happy about this simple fact, since the Revolutionary War wasn't even over. So it started, as so often, one of those wars between Britain and Holland, which have peculiarly complicated history, since, as you know, for a very large part of our history, British kings were Dutch in the first place, or else German. And so usually it was like fighting like. But that was a wonderful introduction to the John Adams experience, the John Adams Institute, and I do congratulate you very much on the 10 years of what you have done. But there's a second wonderful experience that happened to me today. I went to see the Catherine the Great exhibition, which is on in Amsterdam at the moment. And I know this sounds rather an angled way of getting into the subject this evening, but you'll see the point in a minute. Catherine the Great, and I do recommend the exhibition, by the way, as well. The Catherine the Great was an extraordinary woman, as you all know. In Britain, we have something called car boot sales. Now, I don't know whether that phrase means anything in Holland, but what it roughly means is you shove all the junk in the back of the car and take it to a market and try to sell it to other people who, for some reason, buy it, and then and then they've got a lot of junk that they can take to the next car boot sale. If car boot sales had existed in the 18th century, Catherine the Great would have gone to them. She'd have been at every one. She bought anything. If you had a spare dinner service or a collection of paintings at Horton Hall in Norfolk, where I come from, sure enough, Catherine the Great or her emissary would be along, and off it would go to the Hermitage or one of the other palaces. And thing after thing proceeded to the Hermitage. I went there. In fact, in the week that the White House in Moscow was being fired on, the great retrieval that Yeltsin made when he got up on the tank. I went there that week, and the Hermitage was in a state of transition, as presumably it always has been, and they were moving things around from here to there. And most of it, of course, had been acquired by Catherine the Great. Now, amongst the things that she acquired was philosophers. She collected philosophers, and indeed the philosopher of the mid to late 18th century, Denis Diderot. And you will see plenty of references to that in the exhibition. Diderot went to St. Petersburg for 18 months. Now, you know that the French export philosophers in the same way that they export wine. So Voltaire went to Frederick of Prussia. Descartes went to Queen Margaret of Sweden and actually died there of the cold. I think, but I am not. And Diderot went to St. Petersburg. Now, Diderot had just completed the great encyclopedia, the great text of the Enlightenment. And he had acquired a major library in the process of doing this, one of the greatest libraries of the 18th century. Catherine the Great was between lovers, and so she used to see him at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he told her the Enlightenment. He told her how to invent an educational system, a great and enlightened educational system. He told her how to run a new society. He told her how to settle the problem of the serfs. He told her what a good army would be like. He told her what laws were necessary to protect the decent values of the citizens. He told her these things, and she was fascinated. She made notes. She was a writer herself. She sat in her library. She wrote books. And at the end of the 18 months, she made Diderot the paid librarian of his own library, on condition that when he died, the library would go to the Hermitage, which it did. And when they parted, there was a wonderful letter that she wrote to him. Dear Monsieur Diderot, I have so appreciated what you've done for me here in Petersburg. You've taught me how to run an ideal state. You've taught me how to educate my citizens. You've taught me how to build great and civilized cities. You've taught me how to build an order of society that I deeply admire. There's only one difference between us. You write on paper. I write on human skin. In other words, okay, very good idea, but we're not having it here under any circumstances. And they still haven't. Not quite. But what Diderot was actually offering Catherine the Great was America. And she didn't buy it, but John Adams bought it, and Thomas Jefferson bought it, and Benjamin Franklin bought it. And when, very shortly after Diderot returned to Paris, the 13 colonies of the eastern seaboard of the great northern part of the continent of the United States, of the continent of America, began to form a unity of states, began to unite those states. It was the Enlightenment, it was Descartes, it was Rousseau who wrote the description of the society that is instituted, embodied, first of all in the Declaration of Independence, and then in the Constitution. And so America, in that sense, is an invention of French philosophers, and it still is. Why is it that all graduate students in America have to have a French philosopher on the campus, Derrida or Foucault or whatever? It goes back a long way. So the French invent the cultures, and then out of this, the Americans provide what they called the first new nation. And the first new nation was so successful that rather foolishly, the French tried to do it themselves. And they had a revolution at home as well, only to discover that that was rather a mistake. Far better to let the Americans get it sorted and do it. The history of the French Revolution is not the same as the history of the American Revolution, as we all well know. However, the important thing there is that European minds helped construct a new society on American soil, on the northern part of the American continent, a very tiny part of it actually. As a result of so doing, they followed a great tradition that goes back in the European mind, because Europeans, or people in Europe, people in the middle of the earth, people from the Mediterranean, were always inventing America. And if any of you have read the Divine Comedy, Dante's Divine Comedy, you'll remember that one of the great episodes in that is the elderly Ulysses trying to sail his ship away from the middle of the world, the Mediterranean, through the Pillars of Hercules, past Gibraltar, and out into the Atlantic in order to find what lay beyond. What lay beyond, of course, as far as Dante was concerned, in his cosmography, was nothing. There's nothing out there. You see, there's no world. There's no world out there. And so he consigns Ulysses to, was it the fourth circle of hell, for being such a fool, but a wonderful fool, a daring fool. And the point that I'm making is that as far as Dante was concerned, and indeed as far as the Greeks themselves were concerned, that journey west, that journey off the edge of the world, was a journey out of geography, out of history, and yet it was a space that needed to be filled, and it was often filled by fantastic dreams, utopias, ideas of what might lie there. But the assumption was that it lay there outside history, outside the real history, which was written in Europe. Now, that notion, of course, was reinforced as the introduction pointed out, when a group of Puritan dissidents from where I come from my part of the world, Norfolk, East Anglia, and that area that we still call Holland in Lincolnshire, in other words, the North Sea part of England, falling out with the development of the Church of England, sailed to Holland with the desire to found a city on a hill. Well, as you know, there's a problem there. They found cities, but they couldn't find the hill. And so they turned around and went the other way and founded it in Boston, which is a name from Lincolnshire, Boston is attached to Cambridge, which comes from Cambridgeshire, and the Swaffham and Dereham and Norwich and Norfolk and all of those places that surround me, imprinted all over the map of Massachusetts. So, and Connecticut. So the process of settlement is a process of taking names, ideas, words, language, and imprinting it on another place. And the most powerful thing that those settlers did was actually, of course, to take with them the printing press. And so they, by 1630, they had found a press and were able to write America and print it, tell stories about America. And at the same time, they founded Harvard College, so they're also able to teach it as well. And the basic assumption here is that history has begun anew, and that this history starts being written in effect from the moment that lead type is put into the machine. Now, of course, as we all know, that part of American history that precedes this is substantially blanked out. And it's blanked out because of the fictions, the inventions, the imaginings that have taken people across the Atlantic from Europe. It's blanked out in all sorts of shameful ways. A great many of those who went assumed that there was no one there, that America was virgin land. They certainly assumed it had no history, and that the history, as I say, now began. And the only sense that could be made of that history was to attach it to a European history. So all sorts of things were imposed on this, quotes, virgin continent, which was not virgin at all. And a tale began to be written, and the writing was in the hands of those who possessed the weapons that made the writing work. That is to say, an explanation of the whole world, the printing press, and a language which in due time became what we call the American language, although there were many American languages. Now, in that process, there were lots of Americas. There was a Dutch America, there was an English America, there was a Spanish America, there was a Portuguese America, and so on. And each of these nations having a story of its own that might be told. And the accumulation of all these different stories becomes a new story. But there are certain elements that keep returning from one to another. Again, those reaching back, those reachings back to the idea of Avalon, Arcadia, utopia, now a word in use. And so an account of this, as I say, supposedly virgin continent is constructed and accumulated in the minds not just of those who have actually been there and tested other people's imaginings against realities that in many cases seem just as fantastic as any writer could invent, but also it lodged itself in the minds of Europeans to the point where America is one of the greatest fantasies of the Renaissance. And Shakespeare's The Tempest, or, we can think of the ceilings of Tiepolo, enormous numbers of examples of the way in which the idea of America, activated by the so-called discoveries, become a great construct that helps shape elements of a common mythology in Europe. There are all sorts of elements, possible elements, to this mythology. As I say, depending where you start from, it's a very different story if you're sitting in Seville from the story of sitting in Amsterdam. And incidentally, one of the things that fascinated me about this Catherine the Great exhibition, and this is in brackets, is how could she afford all these car boot sales? And the answer, of course, is Dutch bankers. It was all paid for in Holland. as was a great deal of exploration. So I suppose if you were trying to sort of set up an ideal scheme, you needed an Italian navigator like Columbus, and you probably needed a Spanish soldier like Cortes, and you needed a French philosopher like Diderot, and a Dutch banker. So, and so a kind of passage is invented. But coming back to that moment of John Adams, of Thomas Jefferson, of Franklin, the founding of the first new nation, the moment when Americans started, or people in America, people from Europe in America, started calling themselves American, that key moment is the great change in the traffic, the fundamental change in the traffic. Now, we often forget just how tiny this revolutionary America actually was. 13 colonies down the eastern seaboard that happened to have in common the English language. Not entirely, because German was spoken a great deal in Philadelphia, and in fact, one of the things that happened, and think what a difference to history this would have made, after the revolution was that a referendum, another referendum, was taken on which language the Americans should use. And if they'd voted for German, which a lot did, that would have changed history, wouldn't it? So the choice of English is a very significant fact, and that perhaps partly explains why the very proper question that was raised in the introduction about the Anglo orientation of my account is tilted that way. It's not chauvinism. It's because that language and what that language does, the crossovers between things written in English on one side of the Atlantic and on the other, have a very necessary kind of weave to them. Not necessarily a weave of friendship, let me say, but myths, ways of writing, do have a passage that is inevitable. American writers started to influence British writers, just as British writers had deeply influenced American ones. However, the first writer in my book is not British, not American, but a Frenchman. And the argument here is that the first American novel, first real American novel, was written by a European in French. That European was René de Chateaubriand, who came from Brittany and was a rather gloomy vicomte, who in 1791 decided that he would go to the brand new United States, to discover, as he said, the Northwest Passage, having its thought been influenced by, perhaps even met, Thomas Jefferson when he was the ambassador in Paris, because, as you probably know, nearly all the founding fathers were ambassadors to somewhere, and Jefferson, third president, was the ambassador in Paris. So Chateaubriand turns up, nicely avoiding the terror, which is why he's there in the first place, incidentally. And he arrives in the United States, knocks on Washington's door, Mount Vernon. Washington was out, as it happened, or said he was, so he never saw him. So then he went on to Niagara Falls, which even then was a required tourist site. And he says in his account of this, it's a wonderful account, my horse, shocked by the gigantic nature of this spectacle, slipped and began to fall in, but some magic hand lifted us back. And that's the kind of writer he was. What Chateaubriand did was, in fact, go from Niagara Falls, which was then French, in French America, down the Mississippi Valley, which was all French. In other words, he went through Louisiana, went through the America that is called Louisiana. Louisiana was twice as big as the first New Nation. It was a massive landscape, quite richly written, not in fiction, but in record by missionaries and other account keepers, and indeed by the philosophers, by the French philosophers. So there'd been a great debate about, in France and in Louisiana, about the nature of the noble savage and the nature of the Indian, to whom the French paid far more attention than the British ever did, and the English Americans ever did. So Chateaubriand went down the river right to the New Orleans, and in other words, to the tropical part of the river. And he wrote a book about this, a novel. In fact, there are two. One's called Attila, and the other's called René. But Attila is the famous one. And this is an account of an Indian maiden, famous Indian maiden, who became the subject of an opera, of vases, of paintings, all over Europe. But the interesting thing about this, well, one of the interesting things about this story, and I'll go into it a little bit more, is that it was written from 10 miles from where I live, in a place called Bungay, in a house which belongs to a friend of mine, the writer Elizabeth Jane Howard, so it's moved from one writer to another. So why was this American novel in French written in Suffolk? Well, the answer is that Chateaubriand had got himself on the wrong side in the Revolution, had to remain in exile for some time, wrote this book, and then added it to a bigger book called The Genius of Christianity. And it was therefore only when he went back to Paris in 1803, when it was published, by which time he started getting on rather well with Napoleon, who sent him to Egypt and the Orient. And so, having invented America for the French in terms of his own time, he went on to invent the Orient as well. So he became a great writer of the exotic. But the important thing about this myth is how different it is from any English language version. But partly because it is done in the great grand style of a French romantic, wounded romantic philosopher. So Attila, the Indian maiden who is the center of the story, is half Christian. She had been rescued. Her mother has been Christianized, and she has vowed to be a Christian, but apparently rather foolishly, but it helps the plot, has also taken a vow of chastity. She then meets René, who is a French philosopher, who is almost certainly René de Chateaubriand, this lovely French guy who is terribly sad by the ruination of what is happening to Europe, in other words, the French Revolution, there are further parties to this. Various Indians most of whom, it turns out, have been to Paris and discussed their condition with the French philosophers, in rather surprising ways. The novel ends up, several generations later, at Niagara Falls. And the scene is called The Last of the Natchez, the Indian tribe. And the whole tribe by this time has been eliminated either by the French or by wars with rival tribes. And so they gather together in this wonderful, gloomy scene when the last of them stand in front of the falls and reflect on the mutability of human life and the end of the world, a perfect romantic situation. But the important thing about the story, it is a wonderful story, is how, as I say, how different it is in this French version from any British version, but nonetheless, how that story, and it's the story of the French Pocahontas, and the difference between the French Pocahontas and the British Pocahontas, because Pocahontas, as you probably know, actually came to Britain and died appropriate enough in a place called Gravesend, where she's buried. The French Pocahontas thinks. She thinks about God and religion and natural religion, and that is to say Christian religion versus the religion of nature that Chateaubriand reads as the Indian philosophy. She, as I say, takes this rather foolish vow of chastity and then is looked after by a French Jesuit priest called Father Aubrey, who, it seems to me, gives her terribly bad advice, because he says if you've taken this vow of chastity and you love Renee, you should kill yourself, rather than perjure your vow, which she does. So she starves herself to death, and then there's a question of how to bury her, because although she's half Christian, she's also half Indian. So Chateaubriand has to invent this extraordinary ceremony for her burial, and he does it actually on the Monticello estate, Jefferson's Monticello estate. There's a natural bridge, and so he has her buried under the natural bridge, you see, with a Christian ceremony and an Indian ceremony, but in this place of in this place of ritualized nature, romantic nature methodized, but methodized in the romantic way. Anyway, that myth is one of the great European myths. It became one of the great European myths. It's part forgotten now, but you'll find references to it all over the place. And it also became one of the great American myths as well. And James Fenimore Cooper could not have written his books and invented leather stocking without Attila. And it is, in fact, true that Cooper wrote most of the leather stocking novels in Paris, or several of them in Paris, for the French, because he was so popular in Europe. Anyway, the point that I'm making then is that here's a tale which in a sense is the first American novel. And why is it the first American novel so late, 1803? Because the Americans, being Puritans, had more or less banned the novel. They didn't like novels. So the novel came to the United States, the new United States, about a century late. And therefore it came in romantic form, and therefore it tended to deal with things like the Indian in nature, or the individual in nature, and it didn't deal with questions of society so much as questions of the human being at large, man seeking to be free, and so on. But as I say, Chateaubriand did influence the American novel in quite a significant way. Well, Chateaubriand then, the French writer, coming to America and beginning to shape an American tradition. But immediately after this, it became realized that that if Europeans needed America, needed it so much that they would spend all their time inventing it, then Americans, these new Americans, needed Europe. So how did you invent Europe? How did you do the opposite job? Well, the person who found the answer to that was Washington Irving. Washington Irving, who, as his name says, is first generation American, he's called Washington, was trained as a lawyer in New York, and indeed adopted the persona of a sort of American Dutch scholar called Diedrich Knickerbocker, and wrote a history of New York about the Dutch history of New York, a comic Dutch history of New York. Then in the War of 1812, because the British and the Americans couldn't stop fighting each other, the British burned Washington, if you remember, not Washington Irving, and not George Washington, but the town of Washington, and burned the White House, and that made us very good friends. History seems to work in this strange way. So Irving immediately came to England after the War of 1812 to Liverpool and Birmingham, where his family actually had a transatlantic trading business, which went bankrupt because of the war. And Irving, therefore, decided that he'd better find something else to do, and he decided to take a brand new occupation that had just appeared at that time. It's called writer. You could be a writer. A writer had a publisher, and you could make a living by it. You didn't have to have patrons, as they had in the past. You can now earn money as a writer. So Irving did this and wrote a book called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, which is one of the most extraordinary versions of Europe that have been devised. The premise is that America is new, unwritten, and a romantic wonderland, but nobody has learned how to write about it yet. Europe is the opposite. It's overwritten, it's old, it's filled with history, as America is filled with the future, with promise. So Irving actually dichotomizes the new world and provides an old world that is its opposite. And the old world, seen through American eyes, is what Irving then goes on to construct. So what is this old world like? Well, he starts in England, as I say. So he goes to Westminster Abbey. He goes to Stratford-on-Avon. He goes to Oxford. He goes to Cambridge. He goes to English villages with thatched churches and old ladies bicycling to church, as John Major would have said. He goes to Abbotsford. He goes to Edinburgh. And what he actually does is invent an American Express tour, you see. And he invents tourism, American tourism in Europe. And we're very grateful to it. I mean, they still come to see those things, you see. But not only did he do that, having done that for Britain, for England and Scotland, he then went to Germany. And he said that Germany was Walter Scott had told him that Germany was the place where the folktale originated. And if you stopped old ladies in the Black Forest, they would tell you folktales at the drop of a faggot, you know. And so they just stopped them and get the tales. Well, he was smarter than that. He actually went to Dresden and taught people like Tieck But anyway, he got all these folk tales, and then, as I'm sure you know, he decided to transfer some of them to America. And where did he transfer them to? But the Hudson River Valley, so the Germans became Dutch. And they were called, had names like Rip Van Winkle. And he shifted the German folktale onto that particular soil, and at the same time shaped that soil so that when we think of Tarrytown and that region of the Hudson River, we think of Washington Irving, and we think of Rip Van Winkle, and we think of it in a certain way. It's folkloric. Then he went to Spain and lived in the Alhambra, where his shoes can still be found, incidentally. He put them out to be cleaned, and nobody cleaned them, so they're still there. He, amongst other things, invented a wonderful new myth of Christopher Columbus. So he invented Columbus, which completes the circle. You see, wrote a book, Voyages of Columbus, which is the point at which Columbus becomes the great American voyager, the great discoverer, because there are all sorts of other rivals who might have had the office, like Vespucci or so on. But no, it was Columbus, because he wanted the Spanish-American connection. Anyway, here are two writers, one inventing America, a European, the other an American inventing Europe. And my book really is about the continuation of that transaction through generation after generation, changing rapidly all the time. It moves from a romantic version to a realistic version. And then at the end of the 19th century, another Adams, Henry Adams, fourth generation down from John, I think, fourth or fifth, anyway, because the Adams family, of course, were not just an American Gothic comedy program. They were a great dynasty, like the Roosevelts. And this dynasty had Henry Adams, who, instead of performing the office of president, performed the office of historian. And his education was an education in modernity. The old America had gone, and he came to Europe, and the main thing he did, actually, was to go round exhibitions. The great exhibitions that followed the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. He went to Paris, where they put up the Eiffel Tower at the great Centennial Exhibition in 1889. He went to a very important exhibition, which was held in Chicago in 1893, 1 year later, actually, because it was called the World's Columbian Exhibition, and it should really have been 1892, but I think Chicago got it wrong, but never mind. It was an exhibition, a major exhibition, in a city which had already invented the skyscraper. Exhibition lit by electric light and driven by a great hall of machines. And in 1900, he came back to Paris and decided that history had changed, and that the great change was the movement from the Virgin, that is to say, the old Europe, the old world, steered by a religious concept, to the dynamo. The dynamo is the new God. It's a wonderful phrase where he describes how his historical neck was broken by forces totally new. He writes his autobiography in the third person, essentially. He also says that America is destined to take over world power. It will be the 25 million horsepower society. And then it's a wonderful little phrase that he adds saying he's not sure whether Americans can handle the machine and a woman too. Problem that they certainly seem to be facing at this minute. He reconceptualizes the European-American relationship, as were most people in Europe. America was no longer virgin land. It was no longer historyless. It was no longer nature. It was no longer Indians. It was machines. It was skyscrapers. It was modernity. It was modernism. And then from there, it turned into postmodernism. It turned into our condition today. In your introduction, you quoted the impact America made on me when I first went there in the 1950s. Now, at that time, America, first of all, had bailed out a Europe in ruins. Secondly, America was actually 25 years ahead of Europe in every visible thing. And so the strangeness of going, the wonder of going, was enormous. And the result of that was, I think, a kind of suckering of my imagination, certainly turned me into Professor of American Studies, but also an explanation of why it is that American visions of Europe began to be so powerful in Europe itself after 1945. This troubled an idea of Europe. And of course, we now know, as you take over the presidency of the EC, what that amounts to, what difficulties there are, what surprises there are in that process. I'm committed pro-European, incidentally, and I always have to say that because I'm British. And I think there is an interesting lesson to be learned in this relationship to do specifically with the idea of Europe, of the European community. When the first new nation was founded at the end of the 18th century, it wasn't easy going. I mentioned the fact that it was 13 small colonies. It was Thomas Jefferson who created the great United States by a very simple act. He bought the Louisiana that I was talking about from Napoleon in 1803. He tripled for a pittance. You could buy an office block for that now. And Catherine the Great had a dinner service worth more than that. The purchase opened the continent. So a seaboard set of colonies that were the first new nation, first of all acquired the great transit route north-south that the Mississippi was, and then access to the west. Indeed, they discovered that northwest passage that Chateaubriand thought he was looking for very quickly. So they became a great transcontinental nation. But as I say, it wasn't easy, because the question then came, what is America? Where does it start? Where does it stop? Where should our capital be? New York? Philadelphia? Boston? Couldn't agree on that, so they had to invent a place called Washington, D.C. What should our currency be? Well, different colonies, former colonies or states had different currencies. And it really took till the 1830s to sort out the single currency issue, which eventually became what was called the almighty dollar. Then there was the question of federalism versus regional rights, states' rights, which was so contentious that less than 100 years after the first new nation was founded, it had a civil war over that issue, primarily that issue. It was a question of what religion we trusted in. In God we trust, yes, but which God? On the dollar bill, it looks as though it's the Masons. But the crucial thing there was, well, here was a country which had a free border to the west, which was in process of being settled, and all sorts of experimental or alternative societies were developing. Everybody had an idea of how to run America. John Smith decided that the best arrangement was polygamy. So why shouldn't America be a polygamous society? Well, of course, it actually is. It's called serial polygamy. But that became a great issue about the relationship between the separate state and the federal centre. And so it went on over every possible issue that you could think of, including every possible issue that we're going to go through in the European community. Well, let's hope it doesn't come to a civil war in the end. But the very fact that the first new nation, which in a sense, as I say, was imprinted, the idea of it was imprinted from Europe. The issues were imprinted from Europe. That first new nation was one of the first to come up with the notion of a United States of Europe, to match, as it were. And now we are going through that story, the story of the United States of Europe. And here in Holland, as you clean the streets and ready yourself for the summit in June, is it? I hope you'll think of my book. Thank you.
So that looks as though we might not even be 25 years behind, as you noted in the 1950s, but more than 200 years.
Well, sorry, I think I better move that a bit now. In that particular respect, yes. I mean, the first new nation is now very old, whereas many of the nations that were thought of as old are actually quite new, like Germany, Italy. So the relationship is not quite that many people have in their own minds. I mean, obviously there have been ideas of uniting Europe before, some of them megalomaniac, but the question of how you might unite it in some form that somewhat resembles the model of the first new nation. A democratic, rational balance of interests and powers. That is new.
Yeah. Slightly closer to the microphone.
Is that better? Right. Okay.
Now, in your speech, as well as in the book, you describe how Americans go to Europe. For instance, Washington Irving create a certain image of Europe and bring that back with them to America, and therefore shaping an American idea of what Europe is like. The same things happens the other way around. Chateaubriand and other writers, they go to the United States, they get a certain image of what the United States is, take that back to Europe, and therefore shape a European view of what America is. Interestingly enough, not only do the European writers shape America for Europeans and the other way around, but for instance in the case a very interesting case of Washington Irving. He apparently not only creates a European image for Americans, but also for Europeans, for Englishmen.
That's right.
You make it clear in the example of Charles Dickens, which to me, and I suppose to anybody here, the Dickensian Christmas is the archetypal Christmas. In your book you make clear it's actually
it's Irving
Irving's invention.
Yes, exactly.
Could you explain that?
Yes, Irving, am I all right now? Can you hear me now? Irving precedes Dickens by 20 years. The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, which is only one of several books that Irving wrote about Europe, had enormous success and impact, and many people couldn't quite decide whether Irving was American or English. They knew that it had the persona of an American, but since so many books at the time were written with false persona, under pseudonyms and so on, they weren't quite sure the real identity of the author. And therefore, it became increasingly thought of as an English book. And it was assumed that it was a model of English prose style. It was taught in schools. And if you go to old bookshops in Britain, you'll find enormous numbers of editions, English editions of the Sketchbook from the 19th century. Now, 20 years later, when Dickens was starting to write, his problem, of course, was, and Dickens was essentially the writer of a new culture, which was Victorianism. He was the writer of Victorian England. And Victorian England was shapeless, chaotic. I mean, everything was changing so fast. The entire order of the society was changing at massive speed. Cities were growing eightfold and so on. Northern cities were growing eightfold. The Industrial Revolution had taken hold. The railways were coming in. The old village life had now been enclosed, and people who were once villagers now worked on looms in big silk mills or cotton mills or whatever. So suddenly this world that Irving was describing as if it was now is a nostalgia, powerful nostalgia that can be set against the changes that the readers of these books were experiencing themselves. So on the one hand, Dickens is Pickwick Papers, stagecoaches, country Christmases, Christmas carols, Christmas tales, and so on. So there's a core nostalgia for a former England, which is essentially literary, really, and Irving is part of the source of its literary nature. And then there is the struggle to deal with vast historical change in book after book after book, Dombey and Son or Martin Chuzzlewit or whatever. And
yes.
So that's how it...
So like, for instance, in Martin Chuzzlewit, the book, which is also partly situated in America,
yes.
He described there are many journeys between Salisbury and London there, and always they're taken by stagecoach, whereas there were already train connections then.
Exactly. That's right.
Dickens just, he didn't want to write about the modern kind of England, modernism, modern developments.
No, that's right. He sometimes did. I mean, Dombey and Son has the building of the railways in it. But actually, Martin Chuzzlewit, although he didn't quite know this at the time, he was going to use trains, but they're American trains. The trains are all in America, and the stagecoaches are in England.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, in the beginning of these transatlantic pilgrimages, we see Washington Irving walking around in Europe and being very admiring the old culture and everything, as well as we see European writers in the United States admiring the huge land of possibility, the so-called virgin land and everything connected with that. But then, after a number of years, something changes. We get Mark Twain here in Europe, and he writes about Europe in an entirely different way. We get Charles Dickens in America, and he writes in a rather different way about America than Chateaubriand. What happened?
Well, I suppose if you put it in one kind of frame, a kind of academic frame, you could say that the myths that are constructed in the early period have to be deconstructed. And Mark Twain is the great deconstructor, and it's Mark Twain who, in Innocents Abroad, comes to with a party of American tourists on a steamship, the new steamship, on a first package tour to Europe, and they go to Venice, and they say, look, it should look nice when the streets dry out, and it's Mark Twain who invented the famous phrase about, when you've seen one Titian, you've seen them all, he said, the Holy Land was very interesting, but it needed a good coat of paint, and so that kind of brash, undermining American visitor, who of course is much more cunning than the, quotes, innocent of the title, it provides him with a new voice, brand new voice, which he then develops in all sorts of different ways. I mean, in Connecticut, Yankee at King Arthur's court, it's the American entrepreneur, the machine shop superintendent that goes to this world of knights and kings and queens and upturns it, blows it up, in fact, in the end. So in many respects, Twain is identifying with Americanness, meaning American efficiency, American technical know-how, American disrespect for the old and the preference for the new. Those are the things that he... But in fact, the more you read Twain, you realize that it's more ambiguous than that he's absolutely fascinated by kings and queens and princes and paupers. He's absolutely fascinated by old houses. He's absolutely fascinated by Heidelberg and by, where he writes Pudd'nhead Wilson in a house next to Florence with a bust of Dante above his head, the way I've got a bust or a picture of Mark Twain above my head at this minute. So he makes the connections as well as represents the fractures. Dickens, going to America, he was outraged by slavery. So he gives a very negative portrait. When Dickens went to America, he was the most famous writer in the world. The streets of Boston were swept 3 times before he came. I did notice, I have to say thank you, that the streets of Amsterdam are looking a lot tidier than... So the streets were swept 3 times. He had audiences in the many thousands, biggest audiences that ever gathered. And for a writer or a dramatic performance. But he went away disappointed. It's a very famous disappointment. And the Americans couldn't understand why. But essentially, I think the first issue really is slavery. And the shock of seeing slavery in the South. The second issue, I think, was quite simply that the modernity itself, which he had to face, he had to deal with, he had to learn how to write novels that dealt with the kind of things that he'd seen. And it's a key point in his development as a writer. So after that date, the novels change in character.
And I suppose there was also this slight personal thing, Dickens's problems with the fact that people didn't respect copyright.
Yeah,
which happened
that actually was the other
son of a bankrupt father.
Yeah. And of course, one of the reasons why so many English writers did do so well in America was that their works were plagiarized. I mean, they didn't get paid for them; they were just copied by American printers and plagiarized, but that had the effect of holding down American literature, because American writers wanted to be paid for their labors, and if you could get English writers free, why hire Americans?
Yeah. Now, Dickens was one of the first examples, and Twain one of the first examples of, let's say, a rather iconoclastic way maybe of describing one another's cultures. It seems that until today, this tradition has continued. For instance, if I take two American writers, Paul Theroux and Bill Bryson, who've both written two books, one about Britain and one about Europe. To quote one sentence from Paul Theroux's book, The Kingdom by the Sea, which is about Britain, slightly misquoting Dr. Johnson, he starts, "A man who is tired of London is tired of life. No, I was tired of hunting for parking places, tired of the crowds and the scribbled on walls, the dirty old buildings and the ugly new ones. I was sick of London traffic and London presumptions and London smugness." And this is the first page of the book, and it sets the tone for a kind of book, in, one might say, the best tradition of Mark Twain. If a book by Bill Bryson called Notes from a Small Island starts with, "My first sight of England was on a foggy March night in 1973 when I arrived on the midnight ferry from Calais." A foggy March night. I mean, it's again, England and fog, it's more or less the biggest cliche one can think of. But even in the 1980s and 90s, they seem to work. Paul Theroux's book, you referred to the Pillars of Hercules. Paul Theroux's most recent travel book is about that area, the Mediterranean. And again, it's in the same Mark Twain mode. Apparently, that's a very effective way of writing. There's still something to be settled.
Yeah. This actually is one of the most successful books in Britain at the moment. In other words, that critical American eye view of Britain is a very popular art form. You see, it's but at the same time, Jonathan Raeburn going the other way is successful both in Britain and America. Writing books about the American experience with a lot of the same ironies, because they're filled with tropes from all this history that's in here. The tropes are varied. But of course, what I'm arguing at the end of my book, as I deal with the contemporary scene, and because I went on too long about Chateaubriand, I didn't get to that bit in my lecture. Borrowing a term from KLM, the last chapter is called Frequent Flyers. And frequent flyers are writers who don't know where they live. They hop the Atlantic so many times that they write their books in club class on the jumbo. And there are an awful lot of books now that are about the habitual relationship between America and Europe, which overlaps so completely that it's almost a symbiosis. But if you think that it took Irving 6 weeks to sail from New York to Liverpool when he travelled, if you think that the steamship passage only came in really and effectively after the Civil War, and that reduced it perhaps to 10 days, if you think that when I went to America in the 1950s, I went on the Queen Mary and it took 6 days. Now you can fly from Schiphol or Heathrow and be in New York before you leave. See, because all you have to do is turn your watch. When I went on the Queen Mary, that's right, it took 7 days. It took 6 days, and you changed your watch every night. And the groaning that went on amongst the passengers on that ship as they realized that somehow Greenwich Mean Time was being interfered with in this improper fashion. And what's more, they wouldn't know when to get up. They wouldn't know when to have breakfast. They wouldn't know. Wouldn't be able to train their baby to keep up with it. And that was an enormous shock. Now, as I say, time is used so freely by all of us that we most of the time we don't know which country we're in. I mean, I do happen to have grasped that I'm in Amsterdam, but I might be in San Francisco. I might be. A few weeks ago I was in Adelaide, Australia. I might be in Hong Kong. I might be anywhere, according to what plane ticket fell through my letterbox that morning. And so this world is very different from that world. And the world of the frequent flyer, which is a postmodern world, has done something to all these fictions. It's done a great deal to these fictions. And you see, when Irving came and thought about Europe as history, he did actually mean a little bit like what we mean by history when somebody says, do you want to take a boat trip and see Amsterdam's history? See? You want some wooden shoes, don't you, and some Geneva gin, and you can take some tulips back with you, aren't you? See, and that's the Dutch history, as it were, a historical experience. But now, that process is now so engulfing that even I won't say even the Dutch think that that's history, but I certainly say that a lot of people in England think that sort of thing is history. And they are entirely seduced. When you drive around in England now, in a car, if you go through Yorkshire, there's a sign that comes up saying you are now entering James Herriot country. See,
yes,
the vet, and then as soon as you're now leaving James Herriot country, and you are now entering Brideshead country, and you can drive around the entire landscape of Yorkshire. And end up in Catherine Cookson country, Lawrence Dracula country in Whitby. You see, so everything is now a kind of pseudo history, and the liars, that's people like us, otherwise writers, the liars, have laid their lies all over this landscape to enormous success. Most people can't remember. Only know a few simple facts about British kings and queens or when the Battle of Waterloo was, but they do know that Brideshead Revisited was set at Castle Howard, and that's a new kind of history. Well, that kind of history is frequent flyer history or postmodern history, theme park history, depthless history, and it's that depthlessness, I think, that is funded by a great deal of the material that comes out of this. One of the fascinating things that really fascinates me is Euro Disney. If you go to Euro Disney, you see some princes and princesses, you see, very European, except these princes and princesses have been through Disneyland, California, been remanufactured, shipped back to Europe, and put next to Mickey Mouse. So a great conglomeration of cultural artifacts is laid side by side in sort of postmodern joy, which is the same joy that you get from your TV set or surfing the internet or whatever. Randomized relations. Filled with iconographies. One of the things that fascinates me too is that, I write a lot for television, and television is a system of images which are very, very simple in many respects, but are very skillfully manipulated by the people who manage the images. So if you're trying, as they say, to pitch a television series to the BBC or Channel 4 or whatever, you say, well, it's got a kind of icon representing Britain, and it's generally an English country house. It's the Brideshead strategy, find big house, that's England, okay, on from there. So these iconographic objects are used to litter stories with a great deal of mythic content. And then the owners of these places, realizing what profitable objects they possess into the fiction. You see, the house becomes, if you do get a Castle Howard now, you wouldn't know that it belonged to the former governor of the BBC. You would know that it was used by Granada Television for Brideshead Revisited. The management, the manipulation of relations is fascinating. It's very interesting. If we keep, when you turn your television sets on, in the new oncoming digital age, when there'll be 50 screens, 60 screens, whatever, be filled with the same sort of images. Where do they come from? A very large portion of them, whether you're in Hong Kong, in China, wherever, come from this transatlantic traffic. They were born in this transatlantic traffic. And I have an awful lot to do with things being reflected back and forth across the Atlantic between Europe and America.
Now, what you were describing, let's say the fact that Castle Howard is only associated with this serialization of this even war novel, is a sort of final stage of 500 years of transatlantic influence, transatlantic myth-making. Now, it's a rather generally accepted view that until a certain moment in history, the Mediterranean area was the central sea, so to speak, the central area of civilization. Later on, it has shifted. The focus has shifted to the Atlantic Ocean, and obviously we now know, with the kind of economic development that are taking place now, that the Pacific Rim is becoming the most important area economically of the world. What kind of possible cultural influences, what kind of trans-Pacific cultures can we expect?
Yeah. Now, I think this is a very important and a crucial point. There's no doubt that an awful lot of the reference back from America to Europe had to do with the fact that, in a sense, the Pacific coast of America had not really generated its full amount of cultural energies. And once that started to happen, and the Pacific nature of America intensified, then all sorts of relationships in that direction became more and more important. And then, just as after the war, the American-European relationship was reconstituted by martial aid and so on, so that Europe actually had to be reinvented. In a very similar way, Japan was reinvented and became a danger to its recreator in the 80s and early 90s. And now China is being massively reinvented. And then you have a very interesting question as to what it is that's being reinvented. What kind of Japan? What kind of China? And of course, what they're being reinvented in is a model of development which is very American. See? And China, I think, is a very interesting example because just about the time you have your European summit in Amsterdam, Britain loses the last jewel in its crown. You see, the Hong Kong passes from colonial status to a special development zone of China, and in that process, a whole westernized Chinese culture feeds into and probably dissipates out through an already part westernized China, which is with 1.25 billion people in it, is the biggest marketplace, the biggest potential source of cultural energy, the biggest potential source of historical change for 25 years from now. So these maps don't stay the same. They are that's part of the point of the book, indeed, that they are changing all the time, that power changes them, that world historical forces change them. But in a way, it's the process that I'm describing, which is the first adventure from the old world into the new is archetypal and is filled with lessons. So it's not the only one that matters. There's a similar set of relationships that can be set up with the Orient, and that's that marvelous book by Edward Said called Orientalism, which of course is very critical of the European imposition on ideas of the Orient. But more to the point, from my angle, would be this whole question of why, of where the world historical energy is going to be 25 years from now, and what will that do to the present balance of relations in what is already a globalized culture with a very, very large input from America and from Europe.
Now, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left before I have to call it a day. So I would like to give the audience an opportunity to ask, I suppose, maybe 2 or 3 questions, if there are any questions, of course. If there are not, and there are. Yes? Yeah, I shall repeat it. So the influence of Tom Paine on Europe.
Yes, I think Tom Paine is a very interesting figure in several different ways. He also came from Norfolk, from Thetford, and he was a staymaker. He made corsets, and he, having defended the rights of man, and having gone to America before the Revolution, he actually became the most powerful writer of the Revolutionary War, writing in the American cause, that is. And having done that, he then made a very famous statement. Europe, what was it? So famous, I've forgotten it. Something like Europe to monks and princes, America to itself. America to itself. Have nothing to do with the monarchical courts of Europe, or indeed anything European. Having said that, he then came back to Europe and became a deputy in France, and played a significant part in the French Revolution and was imprisoned. And then he went back to America, where he had been a hero, and he was a forgotten hero. And it was an extremely sad story at the end. But Paine, in his passionate revolutionary fervour and his republican fervour, was in a very peculiar sense very British as well. And there was a very strong, of course, republican and an anti-monarchical tradition within Britain. And a lot of people in Britain were fervent supporters of the French Revolution, particularly in its early stages. So Paine belongs to a long critique, and I would think his strongest influence these days was on the Labour Party when we had one, in Britain. Does that seem a fair answer? So, did you want to come back? Okay.
Okay.
One part of the world that's not been mentioned tonight is Eastern Europe. And perhaps most people in the audience know that you've actually invented a country there.
Yes.
And moreover, its language. I don't think it happens to you to be introduced as the author of Quite Come to Slaka, but that's how I chiefly think.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Do you think you ever might find yourself there again? And how are things going in Slaka these days?
It's a very good question. I've already been. In all frankness, that novel is set in Bulgaria. Okay, so after the wall came down, after the Great Change, There was a conference in Veliko Trnovo in Bulgaria about contemporary British fiction, and I was asked to go and speak. And it was organised by the British Council, it was a time of, it must have been December, January, something like that. Time stormed, and we were in the last bus that got through into Veliko Trnovo before there was a blackout, you see, or whiteout rather. So this conference was stuck in this hotel, and nobody could get in or out. We couldn't leave, nobody could come, except for a sudden influx of four-wheel drive vehicles. And it was the deputy president of Bulgaria. His name is Blaga Dimitrova, who is Catch a Princip in my novel, you see. And is also in a book of John Updike's called The Bulgarian Poetess. And she wanted to hear me talk about the book that she was in. And then she told me what had happened to Slaka, you see. And then she told us all what had happened to Slaka. It had the sense to make this dissident Bulgarian poetess deputy president. I noticed she's been kicked out since, so some more things have happened to Slaka. That incident is very vivid to me for the second reason, because, as I say, there are all these four-wheel drives which were her vehicles. But behind it, slipping all over the place, sliding hither and thither, was a Jaguar car. And it was the British ambassador who had to come, you see. So I drove back. I got out in the British Embassy car. Otherwise, I would have been stuck at the conference several more days. This car desperately trying to chase Blaga Dimitrova across this rutted landscape of impassable roads. And finally got back to Sofia. And one of the things in the book is that there's a tomb, and it was actually there actually is a tomb in the great display square in the centre of Sofia. The tomb of the first president, the Marxist who'd been in Berlin, famous figure. I'm sorry, his name has slipped my mind at this point. At any rate, it was like Lenin's tomb. So I asked what had happened to the tomb, and she took me over, and she said, "Oh, they took him out. He's gone. He used to be accused of half a mile. He's gone." So I said, "Well, where is he? I mean, what did you do with the body?" And she said, "Oh, some students took it out in a field and set fire to it. It burned for 5 days." She said.
Okay, well, I understand that the novel you're working on now is actually situated in St. Petersburg, so it looks as though your next step in your career is going to be stepping eastwards.
Yes.
Professor Bradbury, I'd like to thank you very much for your attendance here, for your being here with us. I'd like to thank the audience and apologize that we didn't give them more opportunities to ask questions, but I'm sure that you've enjoyed it very much as well as I have listening to Professor Bradbury. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
The questions can be asked later when Professor Bradbury will be signing books at the book table over there. If you have any questions, you can...
Perhaps I should just say, if you don't mind, that I am a novelist, as well as the author of this book. So you saw me in only one tiny little bit of my real character when I talked about
you gave us a very good glimpse. I regret to close this evening, but it has to come to an end. Thank you very much, Malcolm Bradbury and Hans Bouman and Alfons Lammers, for this very special evening and for this literary and festive and instructive event. Professor Bradbury, I'm sure the audience will agree that you have helped bring American literature closer to all of us. I hope you will sign books now, and I thank you all for coming here, and please have a drink and stay with us. Thank you.